Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Medical, Legal, and Ethical Issues for the EMT. So we're going to take a look at scope of practice, patient consent and refusal, and other legal issues. Let's first take a look at scope of practice. So scope of practice is the regulations, ethical considerations that define the scope or extent and limit of an EMT's job. It can include skills and procedures, and is determined by national, local laws, statutes, and protocols. So basically, this is what you can do, what you're allowed to do within your scope of practice. The Missouri, for example, has set standards that say you can do this, you can do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. In other states, they allow their EMTs to do a little bit more. They allow them to do a little bit less. It just depends on various things that their state allows. So a standard of care. This is care that would be expected from an EMT with similar training when caring for a patient in a similar situation. Meeting that standard of care reduces the risk of legal action. Okay, so what it's talking about here is when you treat a patient and an EMT in the next city over treats that patient the same way, that's standard of care. Okay. Where it gets legal is if you treat that patient, even if it's like out of your scope of practice or anything like that, if you treat that patient outside of that, but you treat them within the standard of care, then you're semi sort of okay. But if you don't, like, so let's say your scope of practice includes administering CPAP or nebulizer, and you've got an asthma patient and you didn't do any of that based on negligence or something like that, then you don't meet the standard of care because the next EMT in the next city over would have given that. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So scope of practice is what you can do, and standard of care is how you should do it. Okay, so let's talk about patient consent and refusal. Consent is the permission from the patient to assess, treat, and transport. So there's a couple different types of consent. There's express consent, which must be informed. So you inform the patient, hey, I'm going to treat you, this is how I'm going to treat you, and they express the fact that they are okay with that. Implied consent means assumed consent. So implied consent is when you have a patient who is altered, maybe because of alcohol, maybe because of a condition, but they're altered. Okay, so any normal adult would want to be treated accordingly. Okay. In the case of minors, you use the implied consent from the parent. Okay, so if the parent is not there to give express consent, then you use the implied consent from the adult. Okay, so that adult says, you know, in any normal situation, the adult would say, yes, I'm okay with you treating my child, do it. Okay, and then always follow local laws and protocols. Okay. So children and mentally incompetent adults, we just talked about this a little bit. Minors are not legally permitted to provide consent or refusal for treatment, and you have to obtain from a parent or legal guardian. And the possible exceptions are in loco parentis, which is where you've got parents that step in, like foster parents or something like that, and emancipated minors. Again, consent. These situations would be The life-threatening illness or injury would be for implied consent, or minors who have children. They can give consent for their own children. They could also give consent for themselves, and minors serving in the armed forces. Okay. Adults incapable of informed decisions about care, just follow your state and local protocol. And again, it's implied consent. So involuntary transportation, the patient is considered a threat to himself or others. There's a court order and usually requires a decision by mental health professional or police officer. If the patient is restrained, they must not risk legal liability. Here in Missouri, if a paramedic or an EMT hears statements by the patient that they want to harm themselves or others, then you have a legal duty to treat that patient and make sure that they seek help. Okay, so again, that would be an involuntary transportation type situation. So when a patient refuses care or transport, they can do so under the following circumstances. The patient must be legally able to consent. Okay, so they've been informed, or they're a minor with children, they're pregnant, they're emancipated, they're in the armed forces, anything like that. The patient must be awake and oriented. They have to be fully informed. So fully informed means that that patient needs to be aware of the risks by not going to the hospital, by not taking an ambulance to the hospital, and all of those things. And the patient will be asked to sign a release form. And despite all precautions, you can still be held liable. Okay, so on refusals of care, we want to make sure that we document, okay? So we want to take all possible actions to persuade the patient to accept care and transport. Spend time speaking with the patient. Listen carefully to try to determine why the patient is refusing that care. Inform the patient of the consequences of not going to the hospital as well. Okay. Consult medical direction if needed. We don't have to in Missouri for any kind of refusal. If the patient refuses, then they're alert and oriented, they're legal age, they can. And the doc really can't say anything to persuade them otherwise. Ask the patient if it's all right if you call a family member, or advise the patient that you would like to call a family member. So if I really think that the patient needs to go to the hospital, I will do everything in my power to try and get them to go. Okay. I recently had a patient who I believe was having some type of stroke. However, he was alert and oriented with intermittent rambling. Okay. But he was alert and oriented whenever I asked him questions. He could answer those questions. He did not want to go to the hospital, but I felt that he was having a massive stroke. So I called the medical director or a doc at the ER, and I said, hey, this is what I've got. Do you have any suggestions on how I can get this patient to go to the hospital with me? And he was like, if you've exhausted everything, then there's not much he can do. The other thing that I did was to try and get the family to convince him to go. They were semi-unsuccessful until the patient was told that he wouldn't be able to possibly work out anymore. So that was a detriment to him. So he really wanted to work out. So we finally ended up getting him to go, and he was able to, he went with us to the hospital. The other thing that I tell patients is if they refuse care once, I don't let them do it again, even though technically they can. But if they call me and their situation is like a heart problem or something like that, I tell them if I have to come back out here again, you're going to the hospital. You don't get a choice that time. So it can be a twofold thing where your patient won't call for an ambulance, and they won't. They may put off calling for an ambulance, but if they've got family there, they'll call for an ambulance, and we'll take them in. Okay. Call law enforcement if necessary. Again, if the patient's alert oriented and they can do everything, then law enforcement can't do anything to help you. But if they are not of themselves, they've made comments or anything like that, then law enforcement can put them in handcuffs and take them to the hospital. So let's think about this. What are the risks of beginning treatment and or transport without getting consent from the patient? So there's lots of risks. If you start doing it, you could be accused of assault and battery. You can be accused of kidnapping if the patient refuses and doesn't want to go with you. So you can do any of that. So what if the patient refuses to sign the refusal of care form? Then you witness it. You have somebody else witness it, preferably not your partner, but you can have your partner witness the fact that the patient refuses to sign. So also, if possible, have a friend or a relative remain with the patient and document all of your attempts thoroughly. So DNRs and physician orders for life-sustaining treatment. It's a legal document expressing the patient's wishes if the patient is unable to speak for themselves. DNRs may be part of an advance directive, may be part of a physician order or life-sustaining treatment. And we should also be familiar with living wills and healthcare proxies. Healthcare proxies are those who can speak or decide my medical treatment in case if I cannot. And that's all they are. So I've had patients and families who say, I have healthcare, I have power of attorney. Okay. So that power of attorney depends on what kind of power of attorney it is. Because sometimes the power of attorney is just for healthcare decisions. And if that patient is alert and oriented, they can make their own decisions and be able to do that. So I've had issues where families will tell me, well, I have power of attorney, he needs to go to the hospital, and the patient is just absolutely refusing to go to the hospital. He's alert and oriented. I don't see anything wrong with him. I can't do anything because of that power of attorney. Okay, all that power of attorney says is I can make decisions when they're incapacitated. Okay. So let's talk about some other legal issues. Negligence. Something that should have been done was not done or was done incorrectly. They must prove that the EMT had a duty to act, that the EMT failed to provide the standard of care expected or failed to act, which is a breach of that duty. They must prove proximate causation, that the patient suffered harm because of the EMT's actions or inactions. And negligent EMTs may be required to pay damages. So you have to have all three of those things in order for them to prove negligence, not just one. They have to have all three. Okay. Res ipsa loquitur, the thing that speaks for itself. Legal concept, important in negligent cases. You have to have all of those things. Okay, is basically what it says. So a duty to act is the obligation to provide care to a patient. It's not always clear. You have off duty and on duty, but out of jurisdiction. So off duty to act you have an ethical duty to act. You don't have a legal duty to act, but you do have an ethical duty to act. And when you're off duty, you also have laws like the Good Samaritan law that provide some type of safety for you. Okay. On duty but out of jurisdiction, if you come up on an accident, like you're doing a transfer outside of your area, and you're on your way back and you come up on an accident, then you have a duty to act as an ambulance and as an EMT and provider. Okay. Follow local laws and protocols and follow your own conscience. So abandonment. Once care is initiated, it may not be discontinued until transferred to a medical personnel of equal or greater training. So if I initiate care as a paramedic, and I start a 12 lead, I start an IV and give them medicine, I then cannot release that patient to my partner who's an EMT. Okay, I can't do any of that. Now, if there was a paramedic on scene, then yeah, I could do that. Okay, I could release care to that patient or to that paramedic, and I can also release care to the nurse at the hospital when that happens. Okay, so, and failure to do so may constitute abandonment. So Good Samaritan laws, I talked about it a little bit. They grant immunity from liability if the rescuer acts in good faith within the level of training. They rarely apply to on-duty personnel, and it may not cover EMTs in some situations, like if you were to practice outside of your scope. Okay, so within your training, and you act in good faith, that Good Samaritan law covers you when you're not on duty. So let's think about this. You arrive on scene of a patient in cardiac arrest. The family says that she has a DNR, but do not know where it is. How should you handle this? So if there's not any kind of documentation indicating that the patient doesn't want resuscitated, then you have to start resuscitation. You have to start CPR. Until they can produce that DNR, then you have to start CPR. You are off duty and arrive on the scene of a vehicle crash. Police and EMS have not yet arrived. Are you legally obligated to stop and render aid? Yes, you're not legally obligated, but you are ethically obligated. Okay, so there's a difference between ethics and legal. You're not legally obligated to stop and render aid, but you are ethically required. Okay, so confidentiality. This is information on patient's history, condition, treatment, considered confidential. The privacy rule of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. We're not going to get too in-depth in HIPAA. That's like 90-some thousand pages long. So the basics of it is that information shared with other healthcare personnel as part of the patient's continuing care, or it otherwise must be obtained through a subpoena. So we can share the information with other healthcare providers that are part of that continuing care. So if you go back to the station and somebody says, hey, I noticed that you ran on so-and-so, what was their problem, anything like that, you are legally obligated not to share any of that information. Okay, you legally can't share any of that information because they weren't involved in the patient's care at that time. So you can't share any of that information. You can't tell them, hey, we ran on so-and-so and they have this and this and this and they're on this and this and this. You can't do that. Okay. Medical identification devices. So these are just a couple examples. There are so many out there. There are bracelets, necklaces. I've even seen a couple tattoos, especially on diabetics, where they put it on their wrist, right here, that they're, type 1 diabetic or type 2 diabetic. So you've got those. For particular medical conditions, you've got the necklace, bracelet, or card. Sometimes if they have a card, it'll be like for a pacemaker, defibrillator type deal. And their conditions include heart conditions, allergies, diabetes, epilepsy, those type of things. Organ donors, they have completed a legal document or the back of their license and tissues in the event for the donation of organs and tissues in the event of death. It may be identified by family members, donor card, or driver's license, and the receiving hospital and or medical direction should be advised per protocol. Safe haven laws. This allows a person to drop off an infant or child at any fire, police, or EMS station. States have different guidelines for ages of children included, and protect children who may otherwise be abandoned or harmed by parents unwilling to or unable to care for them. When we talk about safe haven laws, typically what will happen is you take it as a patient walk up to the ambulance station, you assess the patient, assess the child, and then you take them to the hospital. And then further on to the, social services gets involved, child protective services gets involved, and all that stuff. Crime scenes. We want to, it's the location where a crime was committed or anywhere evidence may be found. Once the police have made the scene safe, the EMT's priority is patient care. Okay, we're not concerned about who did it or anything like that. And we want to know what evidence is. So hopefully, typically you won't go into the crime scene unless there is a patient still alive in that crime scene and PD is there, they've secured it, they know where the evidence is. Hopefully you won't be in there by yourself, and PD will be there with you. So examples of evidence: the condition of the scene, the patient, fingerprints, footprints, microscopic evidence. What I do is if I go up on a crime scene, either like a sexual assault or shooting or anything like that, you want to make sure that you note the position of things in the house. So if you have to move them, you know where they were moved from. Okay. Other things that we need to be aware of, if it's not going to impede patient care, then what I will do, especially like on a sexual assault, I will take and place a sheet, fold a sheet out on the cot and burrito that patient up. That preserves any kind of evidence that may still be on the patient, fingerprints, anything like that. Always wear gloves. Standard precautions apply. Okay, so preservation of the evidence. Remember what you touch, minimize your impact on the scene, and work with PD. Special reporting requirements. So child, elderly, or domestic abuse, violence, gunshot wounds, stabbings, sexual assault, situations where restraint may be necessary. All of those things are required reporting in the state of Missouri. You are a mandated reporter. You have to report these things to PD, to Child Protective Services, Adult Protective Services. You have to be able to, you have to report those things. Do not assume that somebody else is going to report it. Because of the fact that if you assume that somebody else is going to report it, it may not get reported, and then you're legally now liable for the fact that it wasn't reported. Okay, so it doesn't matter if there were, one report, if there was one report, or if there were, 40 billion reports. Okay, as long as it was reported. Intoxicated people with injuries, mentally incompetent people with injuries, and again, check your local laws and protocols. Okay. So let's go over some chapter review. Medical and legal and ethical issues are part of every EMS call. Do you have to be able to, think about those things at all times? Okay. Consent may be expressed or implied. If a patient who is awake and oriented has the capacity to fully understand his situation, refuses care or transport, you should make every effort to persuade him, but you can't force him to accept care or go to the hospital. Okay. Negligence is failing to act properly when you have a duty to act. As an EMT, you have a duty to act whenever you are dispatched on call. You may have a legal or moral duty to act when off duty or outside of your jurisdiction. Abandonment is leaving a patient after you have initiated care and before you transferred that patient to a person with equal or higher training. Confidentiality is the obligation not to reveal personal information you obtain about a patient except to other healthcare professionals involved in the patient's care, under a court order or when the patient signs a release. So as an EMT, you may be sued or held legally liable on any of these issues. However, EMTs are rarely held liable when they acted within their scope of practice and according to the standard of care, and have carefully documented the details of the call. Document, document, document. Okay, I can't say that enough. So at a crime scene, care of the patient takes precedence over preservation of evidence. However, you should make every effort not to disturb the scene unnecessarily and to report your actions and observations to the police. EMTs must have good judgment and decision-making skills when dealing with patient consent and refusal. Avoiding negligence implies using good judgment. Critical thinking is an essential component for avoiding liability. Okay, so last one, EMTs hold responsibility for patients' protective health information. Exercising care when dealing with this information is a legal and ethical obligation. All right, so questions to consider. Remember, we'll just go through these questions and I want you to think about them on your own. So define scope of practice, negligence, duty to act, abandonment, and confidentiality. What steps must you take when a patient refuses care or transportation? And what types of evidence may be found at a crime scene? How should you act to preserve evidence? So let's think about this. You are responding to a motor vehicle crash and find a seriously injured patient. He has no pulse and you're about to begin CPR when someone says, don't do that, he's got cancer and a DNR. No one has the DNR at the scene. Do you start CPR and transport the patient? Absolutely. Okay. We start CPR, we transport the patient. It was a traumatic arrest. So because of the fact that it was a traumatic arrest and not a medical arrest, kind of plays into it too, because the patient signed that DNR mainly because it was a medical problem that he was having and not that trauma that occurred to his body. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. You can text me, call me, email me, and I'll answer those questions for you.